Usually when we talk about a thriving economy, there's this expectation of a machine, like an engine. You put in the fuel, capital, hard work, innovation, and the gears turn.
Right, and the mechanic just points and says, there's your economic growth.
Exactly. There is your prosperity, hard work yields rewards, it's clean, it makes sense. But then you step into the modern world of entrepreneurship, of taxation, of political optics, and suddenly that engine is just, well, it's sputtering.
Oh, completely sputtering. We are looking at a business landscape that is honestly just murky. It is the absolute definition of economic muddy waters.
Yeah, the old rules don't seem to apply in the same way anymore.
They don't, and the mechanics of success have become deeply entangled with politics, public perception, and structural state interventions. Honestly, most people don't fully understand until they're actually caught in the gears.
And that murky landscape is exactly what we're exploring today in this deep dive. We're unpacking a fascinating, highly polarizing, and incredibly revealing interview from the Dutch YouTube channel De Nieuwe Wereld.
Yeah, the guest on this show was Marcel Melis.
Right. And he is a seasoned entrepreneur, a former hedge fund manager who built a fund from nothing to 150 million euros. Plus, he's a real estate investor with over 25 years of experience.
He's definitely been around the block, survived the 2008 crash, built a massive global portfolio.
Exactly. So we are going to explore his provocative claims about the rapidly deteriorating business climate in the Netherlands. We'll extract his insider views on how government policy is actively shaping the housing market, and most importantly, distill his specific, actionable financial advice for protecting your own wealth in an unpredictable world.
Because his perspective is a rare asset, whether you ultimately align with his worldview or not. I mean, he's someone who has spent decades with his feet in the mud, as he puts it.
Right, navigating the highest echelons of global finance and the very literal foundation of local real estate.
Exactly. The objective here isn't to judge the speaker. It's to synthesize his viewpoint so you, the listener, can understand the mechanics of these massive economic and cultural shifts. We want to look at how the people actually moving the capital view these shifts.
Because their decisions ultimately dictate the financial reality you are trying to navigate. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even begin to look at the macroeconomy, we really have to examine the highly personal, very specific conflict that brought him to this interview table in the first place.
Yeah, it's a story that perfectly illustrates the modern clash between private business owners and public politicians.
It really does. So he was publicly targeted by left-wing politicians in Amsterdam. He specifically calls out Zita Pels, a faction leader for GroenLinks, and representatives from the Volt Party. And they didn't just criticize his business practices.
No, they slapped him with the label of Huisjesmelker, which translates to slumlord.
Right, slumlord. They actively campaigned against him, and one politician even stood up in the city council chambers and compared him to Andrew Tate.
Wait, Andrew Tate?
Yeah, explicitly trying to associate him with extreme misogyny and the exploitation of women.
Wow, that is a staggering escalation. In today's cultural climate, comparing a local real estate investor to a globally infamous figure associated with human trafficking and extreme misogyny isn't just hyperbole.
No, not at all.
It's a calculated move. It's designed to make an individual completely toxic, severing their ability to do business, secure loans, or even operate in the public square.
But the contrast between that accusation and his actual track record is just mind-bending. I was looking at his defense, and for 25 years, he has rented properties in Amsterdam, inside the ring road, which is highly desirable real estate, and he rented them below market rates.
Right, but the kicker is his tenant demographic.
Exactly. He specifically and exclusively rented to women, 2,000 women over 2.5 decades. His entire model was built around providing a safe, affordable living environment for women in the city.
And he executed this with a very specific, decentralized philosophy regarding safety and autonomy. Because usually the barrier to entry for young people in major cities is immense.
Oh, yeah. Landlords demand strict pay stubs, guarantors making 4 times the rent, massive deposits.
Exactly. It creates an enormous hurdle for a young woman moving to the city for university or a first job.
But he threw all those traditional barriers out the window. When a room opened up in one of these shared houses, he didn't run a financial background check.
He let the women currently living in the house choose their own new roommate.
Right. His logic was, you are the ones living here, you need to feel safe. The only requirement he instituted was a social media check.
He wouldn't even meet the prospective tenants in person.
No, he said, let's add each other on socials so we know who we're dealing with. And the women chose who they felt safe living with. And overwhelmingly, they only wanted to live with other women. They specifically did not want young men in the house.
What's fascinating here is how this highlights the transition of real estate from a purely economic utility into an ideological battlefield.
Definitely.
You have a private citizen operating on a pragmatic, results-oriented model. He creates a safe environment through self-selection and gender exclusion. And it worked. A 25-year track record, 2,000 women, and 0 incidents of unsafety reported to him.
But that pragmatic model violently collides with the modern political doctrine of absolute equality and anti-discrimination on paper. Because he was actually fined for discrimination.
No kidding.
No. He was financially penalized for discriminating based on gender simply because he wouldn't rent those specific rooms to men.
Wow.
He is penalized for enforcing the very boundary that his female tenants relied on for their safety. It's the ultimate conflict between the reality on the ground and the theory in the bureaucratic rulebook.
It reveals a rigid bureaucratic blindness. The municipality looks at a spreadsheet, sees that men are being excluded from certain properties, and triggers an automatic punitive response based on anti-discrimination statutes.
Right. Completely ignoring the context that this exclusion is the exact mechanism generating the safety and affordability they claim to advocate for.
Exactly.
And the political theater gets even darker. To amplify this smear campaign, he claims that the politicians actually fabricated media. They created a manipulated fake podcast video.
A fake podcast?
Yeah, they edited footage to make it look like she was sitting down in a studio confronting him directly in a podcast setting about being a slumlord, when in reality he had never even met her.
Unbelievable.
He had never spoken to her. He didn't even know who she was until this video dropped.
And this fabricated confrontation was then amplified by local news outlets. Specifically, Het Parool, which he characterizes in the interview as essentially functioning as a mouthpiece for these left-wing parties.
Right. They ran with headlines suggesting he only rented to, quote, blonde women, unquote, completely warping his safety-focused, decentralized trust business model into something that sounded predatory and inappropriate. You know, when I read this part of the source material, it felt exactly like a modern-day digital pillory.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about the medieval town square, where someone is locked up in the wooden stocks and the crowd just gathers to throw rotten vegetables at them. There is no trial. There is no due process.
Right. Today, the court of public opinion is weaponized before a single fact is established.
A politician pulling a €12,000 a month salary, backed by a municipal legal team, can edit a video, post it online, and effectively destroy a private citizen's reputation just to score populist points ahead of an election.
It fundamentally alters what it means to be an entrepreneur today. You aren't just managing financial risk like interest rates, supply chains, labor costs. You are managing a constant existential PR risk.
Exactly. How has social media changed that risk profile for private entrepreneurs?
That is a crucial evolution in the business landscape. In the past, business risk was mostly contained to market forces. Today, the digital pillory is a highly volatile liability on the balance sheet of any public-faced entrepreneur. And he points out a terrifying detail regarding the mechanics of this defamation.
What's that?
He says the politician's legal department greenlit this fake video because they determined it was, quote, on the edge, but allowable for a politician.
Wait, so politicians are essentially operating under a different legal framework for defamation? Because it falls under the umbrella of political speech or campaigning.
Precisely. They are shielded by institutional privilege. The entrepreneur does not have that shield. If he had made a fake video about the politician, he would likely face immediate, crippling civil litigation.
Oh, for sure.
But when the state or a political faction does it to a citizen, it's categorized as political discourse. He was forced to go on national television to defend his character, lay out his track record, and explain his business model.
And he noted that once he explained the facts, 95% of the public comments were on his side. The general public saw right through the political theater.
But the sheer fact that he had to expend the time, capital, and emotional energy to defend himself against institutionalized, state-sponsored character assassination proves that the environment has turned deeply hostile.
Yeah, and that intensely local, deeply personal character assassination serves as the perfect gateway into his broader, macro-level thesis, because he doesn't view this as a weird, isolated incident.
No, he views it as a symptom of a much larger systemic disease.
The environment hasn't just turned hostile culturally, it has turned hostile economically. Which brings us to the entrepreneurial exodus. He describes feeling like a pariah in his own country. He says he feels like nothing more than an ATM for the government.
An ATM. Yeah, they don't value the housing he provides. They don't respect the capital he risks. They just want to extract his cash to fund their programs.
And the prime catalyst for this exodus isn't just name-calling. It is the looming reality of the Dutch tax code.
We have to look closely at the upcoming changes to the tax code because they are fundamentally altering the mathematical calculus for wealth creators in the Netherlands and arguably across all of Europe.
So he points specifically to a massive looming wealth tax the Vermogensen was belasting. That is slated to start in 2028. It is a 36% tax on unrealized gains in private wealth. Now, I want to make sure I am grasping the sheer danger of this concept because I know taxing unrealized gains is the boogeyman that terrifies institutional investors.
Oh, it absolutely terrifies them.
Let me try to break down the mechanics of this and you tell me where I'm off. Historically, taxation happens at a transaction. If I buy an apartment building for 1 million euros and 10 years later I sell it for 2 million euros, I have a realized profit of 1 million euros.
Right.
The government takes a percentage of that cash profit because I actually have the cash from the sale sitting in my bank account. That makes total sense.
That is the traditional capital gains model, yes. The tax event is triggered by liquidity. You have the money to pay the tax.
But a tax on unrealized gains completely severs the tax event from the liquidity. Under this new 2028 law, if I buy that building for 1 million euros and next year the market gets hot, a municipal appraiser says, hey, your building is now worth 1.5 million euros on paper.
Even if you haven't done anything to it.
Right. I haven't sold it. I haven't collected an extra dime in rent. I haven't made any actual money. But the government says your wealth increased by 500,000 euros this year. So you owe us 36% of that increase, meaning I have to write a check to the tax authority for 180,000 euros in cold, hard cash.
You have nailed the exact mechanic, and you've highlighted exactly why it is inducing massive panic. The government is taxing a theoretical paper valuation as if it were liquid cash.
But where does that 180,000 euros come from? My money is tied up in the bricks and mortar of the building. I don't have that sitting in a checking account.
And that is the fatal flaw of the policy that he is screaming about. If you don't have the cash lying around, and most active real estate investors or business owners reinvest their cash flow, so they are generally illiquid, you only have two options.
What are they?
You either have to take out a loan against the property to pay the tax, assuming interest rates allow it, or you are forced to sell the asset entirely just to generate the cash to pay the tax on the asset.
It's forced liquidation. It's essentially a slow-motion seizure of private property.
He calls this a lefter-than-left policy. It is a structural mechanism that prevents long-term capital accumulation and forces constant asset turnover. If the market goes up 10% every year, you are bleeding cash every year just to hold on to the property you already own.
If the market crashes the following year,
the government doesn't typically write you a refund check for the unrealized losses you paid taxes on the year prior. It is asymmetrical risk, heavily skewed towards state extraction.
wow. And it's not just the big real estate tycoons getting hit either. He points out that the burdens on the smallest players, the single-person businesses, the iemenzak, are totally crushing. He literally calls the Dutch single-person business structure the dumbest construct ever invented.
Yeah, because of the sheer volume of administrative taxes, hidden fees, and regulatory hoops thrown at the most vulnerable solo entrepreneurs trying to get off the ground.
And then you layer the labor laws on top of the taxation. The friction to scale a business is immense. He mentions a conversation he had with a foreign entrepreneur, an associate from the United States, and when he explained Dutch labor laws to this American, the guy physically could not believe it.
I read that part. He was talking about the mandate that employers are on the hook to pay 2 full years of sick leave for an employee.
Yes. He said the American asked him to repeat it 3 times because the concept sounded so absurd to someone outside the European system.
To understand why that is so shocking, you have to look at the mechanics of risk from the employer's perspective. In the U.S., employment is largely at will, and while there are short-term disability programs, the financial liability doesn't sit squarely on the small business owner for years on end.
Right.
In the Netherlands, if a solo entrepreneur finally decides to scale up and hire their very first employee, that hire carries a potential 2-year fully paid liability if that person falls ill or experiences burnout.
Yeah, if you are a small bakery or a tech startup with thin margins, paying an employee's full salary for 2 years while they aren't working, plus having to hire a replacement to actually do the job, would bankrupt you instantly.
It acts as a massive disincentive to hire full-time staff. It forces businesses to rely on temporary contracts, freelancers, and complex agency structures, which actually reduces job security for the average worker.
Which is the exact opposite of what the labor law intended to achieve in the first place.
Exactly.
So we have the digital pillory, destroying reputations, unrealized gains taxes, forcing asset liquidation, and labor laws making growth an existential financial risk. What is the result? He isn't just sitting in a studio complaining, he's acting.
Right. He has already sold 80% of his Amsterdam properties.
He is taking his capital and pulling it completely out of the Dutch market. He notes that he speaks to roughly 1,000 entrepreneurs a year in his network, and nearly all the highly successful ones are currently building Plan B exit strategies.
They are packing up their capital, their businesses, and moving to jurisdictions that welcome wealth creation, places like Dubai or Marbella in Spain.
But I have to play devil's advocate here on behalf of the listener. A cynic might listen to him and say, so what? A wealthy landlord is whining about paying his fair share of taxes and taking his ball and going home to Dubai. Let him leave. Why is this a structural threat to the wider economy?
That is the core tension of any modern welfare state, and it's a vital question. You have to impartially examine what happens when a society views its business class merely as an extraction resource. Let's look at the mechanics of the golden goose narrative.
Okay.
The state needs massive, continuous amounts of tax revenue to fund social safety nets, healthcare infrastructure, and green transition initiatives. That is a material reality. But if the taxation and regulatory burden becomes so high that the golden goose decides the friction of operating in Amsterdam is no longer worth the reward and they fly to Dubai, the state doesn't just lose the extra tax revenue they were trying to extract.
They lose the base tax revenue entirely.
Exactly. They lose the corporate tax, the income tax of the entrepreneur, the payroll taxes of the employees they used to hire, and the secondary economic activity like the local accountants they hired, the local restaurants they ate at.
Yeah, that's a massive compounding loss.
Furthermore, let's look at housing. The public might cheer when a wealthy landlord is taxed so heavily he sells his portfolio. But who does he sell to? He explicitly states he sold his properties for top dollar to wealthy expats.
Wait, so the housing supply for middle-class or lower-income renters actually shrinks? The affordable rental stock is permanently removed from the market and converted into luxury owner-occupied homes.
Yes. The entrepreneur escapes to Marbella. He keeps his capital, but the domestic economy and the local renters are left holding the bag.
That is the mechanical reality of capital flight. Capital is highly mobile. Physical infrastructure and local citizens are not. When the environment turns hostile, the capital leaves, and the local population suffers the deficit.
Exactly.
Which leads us directly into a highly polarizing part of his worldview. Because he doesn't just blame tax spreadsheets and labor laws for this hostile environment, he actively points the finger at social policy, immigration, and a breakdown in public safety.
Right, and it is vital to understand this perspective analytically without endorsing or condemning it.
Right, because it reflects a rapidly growing sentiment among the European business classes that is demonstrably shifting political power and moving markets.
Capital flight and economic stagnation are rarely driven purely by tax rates. They are often driven by these exact cultural and safety concerns intertwining with economic frustration. When an entrepreneur feels the social contract is broken, their willingness to tolerate high taxes evaporates.
So he contrasts his own extremely safe, heavily vetted, female-only housing model with a municipal housing experiment in Amsterdam called Stijkoost. According to him, the city decided to mix young university students with recent immigrants in a shared living complex.
And he claims this ideological experiment was an absolute disaster, leading to numerous incidents, physical assaults, and even rapes.
And he makes the heavy allegation that the municipal authorities actively swept these incidents under the rug to protect their political narrative.
He uses this as a prime example of ideology blinding policymakers to ground-level reality. His argument is that politicians make decisions based on what sounds virtuous in a theoretical, socially progressive framework, like the idea of forced integration fostering community.
But because these policymakers don't have their feet in the mud, they fail to understand the practical, sometimes dangerous consequences of those decisions on the people actually living in those spaces.
And his view on the broader city environment expands from there. He argues that European cities have become deeply unsafe, and he specifically attributes this to what he calls illegal, criminal immigrants from safe countries.
But he makes a very sharp, very specific distinction here that I think is important to highlight. He isn't talking about all immigration, and he isn't talking about older generations. He explicitly praises the hardworking Turkish and Moroccan communities who came to the Netherlands decades ago.
Right. He states that they agree with him completely. They also want the criminal elements deported because it impacts their daily safety and threatens their local businesses just as much as anyone else's.
This raises an important question about how economic extraction merges with cultural alienation. He represents a demographic of wealth creators and everyday workers who feel that the fundamental social contract of a high-tax society has been breached.
The implicit agreement in Northern Europe has always been you pay exorbitant taxes, and in return, the state provides world-class infrastructure, pristine public services, and absolute public safety.
Right. And he is arguing that the state is still demanding the exorbitant taxes, but failing to deliver the safety, instead spending that capital on ideological experiments that actively degrade the living environment.
He goes so far as to praise the dramatic shift toward right-wing politics across Europe. He points to the rise of the AfD in Germany and the conservative political climates in Eastern Europe, framing them not as radical movements, but as a necessary, inevitable correction against what he bluntly calls the white left elite.
He sees the current leadership class as fundamentally disconnected from the desires of both the working class and the business class.
He cites a fascinating metric regarding voter sentiment. Whether it is statistically perfect or more a reflection of his own network sentiment, he claims 50% of the country doesn't even bother to vote out of pure apathy, believing the bureaucratic system is completely rigged and unresponsive.
And he argues that 50% that does vote is entirely ignored. He claims the populace at large does not want to fund foreign wars, they do not want to fund massive, economically crippling climate initiatives, and they do not want mass immigration. Yet, the political class forces these policies through via unelected bureaucracies anyway.
So I have to ask you about the corporate posture here. Historically, the corporate strategy was quiet, behind-the-scenes lobbying. You make your donations to the centrist parties, you shake hands at the golf course, you advocate for lower corporate tax rates, and you stay far, far away from the public culture wars.
You stay apolitical to protect your brand. Exactly.
Hmm.
But here is this highly successful former hedge fund manager sitting on a YouTube show declaring Europe is lost if it doesn't swing hard to the right and calling out specific politicians by name. Is the era of the quiet, apolitical executive dead?
I believe it is rapidly dying, yes. When the political environment begins to threaten the foundational mechanisms of capital, like property rights via the unrealized wealth tax, or personal safety or reputational survival via the digital pillory we discussed, business leaders feel they can no longer afford to be apolitical.
The stakes are just too high.
The stakes have moved from marginal tax rate adjustments to existential operational viability. Him speaking out so aggressively and stating that thousands of his peers agree with him privately is a massive signal that the traditional back channels of corporate influence have broken down. The trust in the establishment institutions is gone.
And that brings up the million-dollar question. How did the relationship between the business community and the state break down so completely? It obviously didn't happen overnight with one tax law.
Yeah.
He actually traces a very specific chronological timeline of broken trust. I want to dive deep into this because he starts all the way back in 2001.
This timeline is absolutely crucial to our deep dive because it perfectly illustrates the boiled frog syndrome. If you throw a frog into boiling water, it jumps out. If you put it in tepid water and slowly turn up the heat, it boils to death without realizing the danger.
That's a great analogy.
The temperature of regulation, state overreach, and institutional friction was turned up so slowly over 2 decades that many entrepreneurs didn't realize they were cooking until their capital was already trapped. We need to look closely at when the water actually started getting hot.
Let's debate that timeline, starting with his first major milestone, 2001 and the introduction of the euro. Now, on the surface, this is counterintuitive. He was a businessman trading internationally. You would think he loved the euro. Open borders, no currency exchange fees, no customs forms.
But in retrospect, he views the euro as the first fatal blow to the Dutch business climate.
I look at it this way. Before 2001, the Netherlands had the guilder. It was the notoriously strong, stable currency backed by a highly productive, export-driven economy. When they adopted the euro, they essentially surrendered their national checking account to Brussels. But why exactly is that an economic disaster for a local entrepreneur? Wasn't a unified currency supposed to make European exports massively more competitive on the global stage?
In theory, yes, it reduces trade friction. But look at the mechanics of what they actually surrendered. Sovereign monetary policy. When a nation controls its own currency, Its central bank can adjust interest rates and print money based specifically on the needs of its domestic economy.
Right. If the Dutch economy is overheating and inflation is rising, the Dutch central bank raises interest rates to cool it down.
Exactly. When they joined the euro, they handed that lever to the European Central Bank in Frankfurt. The ECB has to set one single interest rate for the entire eurozone. So you have the highly productive, fiscal conservative northern economies like the Netherlands and Germany sharing a currency with the wildly different, often debt-heavy southern economies like Greece, Italy, and Spain.
So the interest rate becomes a blunt instrument.
Yes. The ECB often had to keep interest rates artificially low to prevent the southern economies from defaulting on their massive sovereign debts. But those low interest rates were disastrous for the Dutch, who needed higher rates to encourage savings and cool down their housing market.
Right. So he views 2001 as the moment the Dutch economy became subservient to a political project. The water started getting warm. The local entrepreneur was no longer the priority. Keeping the Eurozone intact was the priority.
Which leads us to the moment the water really started boiling, 2008, the global financial crisis.
Yeah. He paints a picture of banking before 2008 that sounds almost romantic. He says banks used to be true partners. A local branch manager would literally come to your kitchen table, drink a cup of coffee, look you in the eye, assess your personal character and your business plan, and offer you a loan. It was relationship banking.
Because the banker's success was directly tied to your operational success. They wanted you to grow, they understood your local market, and they had the autonomy to underwrite risk based on human judgment.
But post-2008, everything changed. The regulatory backlash was so severe that the human element was stripped out entirely. Compliance took over. And he shares a shocking personal anecdote from this era regarding interest rate swaps that perfectly captures this betrayal.
Oh, the swap story is incredible.
Let me try to construct the mathematical model of a swap here. He had massive real estate loans with variable interest rates, meaning if global interest rates went up, his monthly mortgage payments went up. The banks came to him and said, hey, let's protect you from inflation. We will sell you an interest rate swap.
It acts like an insurance policy.
Right. We will put a collar on your loan. If rates go above a certain ceiling, we cover the difference so you don't go bankrupt. But to pay for this, we also install a floor. If rates drop below a certain point, you have to pay us a premium. Have I got the mechanics of that right?
You have the mechanics perfectly right. It was marketed as a hedging tool to create predictable cash flow for entrepreneurs. The bank assured him that interest rates would never drop below that mathematical floor, so it was purely a protective measure against high rates.
But then 2008 happens. The global economy implodes, and central banks, desperate to stimulate borrowing, slash interest rates to zero. And eventually, incredibly, they pushed interest rates into negative territory. The scenario the banks had previously promised him face-to-face was mathematically impossible.
And this is where the algorithmic ruthlessness kicks in. Because the rates dropped far below that agreed-upon floor into negative territory, the mathematical structure of those swap instruments inverted. Instead of protecting him, the swap triggered massive compounding penalty fines.
It's like buying an expensive umbrella from a salesman who promises it will protect you from a hurricane. But the umbrella only opens when it's sunny, and the moment it actually starts raining, the umbrella actively fines you $1 million for getting wet. And he says he was hit with literally millions of euros in fines.
And the bank's response wasn't partnership. They didn't come back to his kitchen table and say, wow, negative interest rates are a black swan event we never predicted. Let's restructure this so we both survive. Their response was contractual ruthlessness.
The algorithm says you owe us millions, pay up, or we seize your assets.
This marked the permanent shift from relationship banking, where you assess the person, to algorithmic compliance banking, where the bank acts as an enforcer of rigid, context-blind rules. The regulatory burden post-2008 turned banks into an arm of state surveillance.
Entrepreneurs went from being valued clients to being viewed as high-risk, inherently suspicious entities that required constant auditing and extraction.
And the final nail in the coffin of trust, the moment the frog realized it was boiling to death, was the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020.
Right. According to him, the government arbitrarily decided which businesses could survive and which had to die. Small family-owned hospitality businesses, cafes, and local shops were forcibly shut down by state mandate for months on end. Meanwhile, massive corporate supermarkets were allowed to stay open, selling the exact same goods and raking in record profits.
The pandemic response shattered the illusion of a level playing field once and for all. It demonstrated the raw, terrifying power of the state to simply turn off an entrepreneur's livelihood overnight without due process based on emergency decrees that heavily favored monolithic corporations over independent operators.
When you string those three macro events together, the loss of monetary sovereignty in 2001, the algorithmic betrayal of the banks in 2008, and the arbitrary destruction of operational autonomy by the state in 2020, you see exactly why modern entrepreneurs feel like they are under siege.
It creates a deep-seated, entirely rational cynicism.
If you mathematically deduce that the system is fundamentally designed to extract your wealth, limit your freedom, and punish your success, your only logical response, defensive posturing. You stop investing in the local community, you stop hiring local workers, and you start looking for the exit doors to Dubai.
That timeline is the architectural blueprint of capital flight. It isn't sudden, it's a cumulative exhaustion with systemic friction.
Okay, having thoroughly explored this sweeping, gloomy macro environment, we need to zoom back into his primary industry. We need to talk about real estate. Because every single listener out there, whether they own their home, rent a studio, or are trying to buy their first place, is feeling the acute pain of the housing market. Why is housing so incredibly expensive? He has a very clear answer, and it flips the standard political narrative completely on its head.
The standard political narrative, of course, is that greedy landlords, speculative foreign investors, and unbridled capitalism are hoarding properties and artificially driving up prices.
Exactly. But he argues that landlords aren't the root problem at all. He says that government is the sole, primary creator of the housing scarcity. How? Through a suffocating web of environmental regulations, incredibly high municipal building costs, zoning laws, and strict rent caps in the social and middle sectors.
Let's work through the math of a rent cap, because on the surface, rent caps sound like a victory for the working class.
Right. If the government mandates that a landlord cannot charge more than €1,000 a month for an apartment, shouldn't that guarantee affordable housing?
In a theoretical vacuum, a rent cap sounds wonderfully compassionate, but we live in a material reality governed by the law of supply and demand. If we connect this to the bigger picture of real estate development, you have to look at the input costs. Land costs money. Pouring concrete costs money. Paying unionized labor to build the structure costs money. And most importantly, borrowing the capital from the bank to finance the construction costs money.
Okay, so let's say a developer wants to build a new apartment complex in Amsterdam. They run the math, and between the cost of the land, the environmental permits, and the interest on the bank loan, they realize they need to charge €1,500 a month in rent per unit just to break even and eventually turn a small profit.
But the government rent cap says they are legally forbidden from charging more than $1,000.
Precisely. So what happens? The developer looks at the spreadsheet and realizes they will lose €500 a month per apartment in perpetuity. Capital is deeply rational. No investor, no pension fund, no developer is going to intentionally pour tens of millions of euros into a project that is mathematically guaranteed to generate a massive loss.
So they just don't build the apartment complex. They walk away. The capital goes somewhere else.
Development freezes entirely. The new housing units that the city desperately needs are never built. But the population keeps growing. People keep immigrating. Students keep graduating. The demand rises relentlessly, but the supply is artificially capped by the regulation.
So you have more and more people fighting over the exact same limited pool of existing older homes on the free market.
And that artificial scarcity acts like rocket fuel for the prices of the existing homes. Because there is no new supply to alleviate the pressure, the cost of an unregulated free sector apartment skyrockets to €2,500 a month, and the purchase price of a standard row house hits €500,000.
Which leads to this incredibly bitter, cynical irony in his interview.
Oh yeah, he looks straight at the camera, and he actually thanks the government for their gross mismanagement. He says, "Thank you, politicians. Your incompetence, your rent caps, and your endless permit delays created such a massive artificial shortage that you tripled the value of my existing property portfolio over the last 25 years.
It is the ultimate paradox of state market intervention. Policies explicitly designed to protect the vulnerable renter end up freezing development, skyrocketing the value of assets held by the wealthy incumbent landlords, and ultimately making housing completely hopelessly unaffordable for the next generation.
He got incredibly rich off this exact dynamic, but he is stepping forward to acknowledge that it is a toxic dynamic that is ultimately destroying the social fabric and economic mobility of the country.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most important segment of our deep dive. He paints a bleak macroeconomic picture. He sees inflation, taxation, and government incompetence hollowing out the middle class. But he doesn't just complain. He pivots to highly specific, pragmatic financial advice for regular people trying to survive this shift.
He lays out a survival guide for beating what he calls the inflation spiral.
And this is where the theory becomes highly actionable for the listener, because understanding the macro environment is only useful if you apply it to your personal balance sheet.
His first rule is a harsh truth for a culture that traditionally prides itself on being thrifty and cautious: the trap of saving. He warns that traditional saving in a fiat bank account is financially suicidal in today's climate.
It really is.
Let me run the math on this because it's terrifying when you actually see the numbers. If real inflation is running at 10%, meaning your groceries, your energy bill, your car insurance costs 10% more this year than last year, and the bank is graciously giving you a measly 2% interest on your savings account, you are bleeding wealth.
You are mathematically losing 8% of your purchasing power every single year simply by doing nothing and playing it safe.
He is referring to the silent, invisible erosion of purchasing power. A €100 bill might still say €100 on it a year from now, but if it buys 8% less food, you have objectively lost wealth. Inflation is a stealth tax on the poor and the middle class who hold their wealth in cash, while the wealthy hold their wealth in assets that inflate in value.
So how do you stop the bleeding? How do you protect yourself? He offers a few very clear hierarchical directives. First, despite the crazy inflated market we just talked about, he advises buying a house.
Right. If you plan to stay in the country long term, buy property. Why? Because he predicts that the government mismanagement and the artificial scarcity will not be solved anytime soon. The politicians won't reverse course. Therefore, demand will continue to outstrip supply, ensuring that housing prices continue to rise. Real estate is a hard asset. It floats on top of the inflation floodwaters rather than drowning in them.
It acts as a highly leveraged, relatively stable hedge against the devaluation of fiat currency.
Second, and here's where it gets really interesting, this high-flying, risk-taking, multi-millionaire former hedge fund manager, a guy who traded complex energy derivatives and built a €150 million fund from scratch, tells the average listener to do the most boring, steady, unsexy thing imaginable. He says, invest in ETFs, exchange-traded funds.
He explicitly warns against the average retail investor trying to pick individual stocks. He calls stock picking by amateurs pure casino gambling. You do not have the informational edge required to beat the market consistently.
He says just buy a broad market ETF, which is essentially a basket that holds tiny fractional pieces of hundreds of the biggest, most profitable companies in the world, aim for long-term growth, and then the most crucial step: do not touch IT.
Just let it sit for decades and let
Yeah.
compound interest do the work.
But let's break down why an ETF works so well for the average listener compared to a hedge fund.
Yeah.
Because he notes that to even get in the door of his old hedge fund, you needed a minimum net worth of over $1 million.
Well, a hedge fund uses aggressive leverage, short selling, and complex derivatives to try and generate absolute returns regardless of what the broader market is doing. It requires constant active monitoring, incredibly high fees, and a massive risk tolerance because you can lose your entire principal.
Right.
An ETF, however, doesn't try to beat the market, it simply is the market. By buying a global stock ETF, you are betting on the general upward trajectory of human productivity, technological innovation, and corporate profitability.
And this ties directly into a critical concept he mentions: the wage price spiral, or the loan and price spiral. I want to make sure I fully grasp this doom loop. Let me explain the wage price spiral as I understand it, and you refine it. When the government prints money or enacts policies that drive up the cost of living, like higher energy taxes, inflation spikes,
Okay.
workers look at their grocery bills and say, I can't survive. I demand higher wages. They strike or negotiate, and companies are forced to pay these higher wages. But the companies aren't going to just eat that cost and destroy their profit margins. So to maintain their margins, they pass those increased labor costs directly onto the consumer by raising the prices of their goods, which causes more inflation, which causes workers to demand even higher wages next year. It's an endless spiral. Am I getting that right?
You're getting the mechanics right, but you are missing the crucial lag time that destroys the middle class. As an everyday citizen relying on a salary, your wages will almost never rise as fast as corporate prices. You will always be losing the race because price hikes are immediate, but wage negotiations take months or years. You are always playing catch up.
Wow, yeah.
The only mathematical way to outpace that inflation is to own a piece of the entities that are successfully raising those prices, the corporations. By owning a broad ETF, you own a tiny slice of the global corporate machine. When they raise prices to combat inflation, their revenue goes up, their stock price goes up, and your ETF portfolio goes up. Investing in equities is the only reliable way the everyday citizen can ride the wave of inflation rather than being crushed underneath it.
That is a brilliant breakdown. Own the machine that makes the prices, don't just be the consumer paying them. So ETFs are the way to go. But he also has a very clear, urgent list of what to avoid. He says stay far away from altcoins. He thinks Bitcoin is okay as a decentralized digital asset, but the thousands of other crypto coins are pure casino gambling with no underlying utility.
Right.
But his biggest, most massive warning, the thing he practically shouts into the microphone, is regarding something called bridge financing. He predicts this is going to end in absolute tears for retail investors within the next 5 years. What exactly is bridge financing, and why is a guy who survived 2008 so terrified of it?
To understand the danger here, we have to look back at what we discussed about the banks. Because traditional banks have become algorithmically risk-averse and heavily regulated, they have made it incredibly difficult for real estate developers to get construction loans. The compliance friction is too high.
So what do the developers do?
They are increasingly bypassing the banks and turning to private individuals for funding. A developer might come to a group of retail investors, everyday people with some savings, and say, lend me 50,000 euros for 2 years while I build this apartment block, and I'll pay you a guaranteed 8% interest. That is a bridge loan. It bridges the gap until the project is finished and sold.
I mean, honestly, that sounds great on paper. 8% absolutely beats the bank's 2% savings rate. Why is that going to end in tears?
It sounds great until the music stops. He points directly to the real estate market in Germany right now, which is currently undergoing a severe, largely unreported collapse. If property values drop due to high interest rates or building costs overrun due to inflation, the developer's profit margin vanishes, they go bankrupt, the construction project is halted, it becomes a half-finished concrete skeleton.
And those private retail investors who lent the 50,000?
They are completely wiped out. They are at the bottom of the creditor list. They do not have the institutional protections, the legal teams, or the collateral recovery mechanisms that a major bank has. Wow.
He sees retail investors, desperate for yield because of inflation, chasing these highly illiquid, massively risky private real estate loans. He knows exactly how that movie ends because he saw the exact same dynamic wipe out fortunes in 2008. The risk is asymmetrical. You get an 8% upside, but a 100% downside.
He literally says it will lead to tears. It's a stark warning to stay out of the private debt markets unless you are a professional. And finally, for his last piece of pragmatic advice, he introduces a fascinating wild card. We are talking about a guy who built his career on human relationships and instinct, but he explicitly recommends that everyday investors use artificial intelligence, specifically ChatGPT, to vet fund managers, check reputations, and read complex financial statements.
He says if you don't understand a 50-page mutual fund prospectus, feed it to the AI and ask it to explain the hidden risks in plain language. It represents the ultimate democratization of financial analysis. He is advocating for using AI as an equalizing tool, a tool that provides the kind of deep dive due diligence that used to require hiring a team of expensive financial analysts. It's a way for the retail investor to pierce through the corporate jargon and protect their capital.
So what does this all mean? Let's recap the incredible journey we've just been on. We started with a localized, highly personal political clash in Amsterdam over a female-only housing model and the terrifying weaponization of the digital pillory.
We zoomed out to explore the shifting macroeconomics of Europe, the timeline of broken trust spanning from the 2001 euro adoption to the 2008 banking algorithmic betrayal. We unpacked the paradox of government regulations actually causing the housing scarcity they claim to fight.
And we ended with a harsh, highly actionable financial playbook for surviving the inflation spiral by avoiding fiat savings accounts, avoiding private bridge loans, and relying on broad market ETFs.
The central through line connecting all of this complex material is self-reliance. Whether you agree with his intense political views on the European left, his stance on immigration, or his disdain for taxation, his underlying premise is vital for your survival. Understanding how high-level wealth managers view the mechanics of inflation, market scarcity, and political risk gives you a critical advantage.
His ultimate message is that the paternalistic institutions of the past, the banks that partnered with you at the kitchen table, the government that protected your purchasing power, are gone. You have to look out for your own financial well-being because the system is no longer designed to do it for you.
You have to be your own mechanic for that economic engine we talked about at the beginning. But before we leave you today, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. Something to mull over on your own that builds on everything we've discussed today. Specifically, his final piece of advice.
The AI advice, right?
Yeah. He advises the everyday investor to use ChatGPT to vet financial managers and assess risk, effectively replacing traditional trust in human bankers with trust in AI. It makes complete sense on an individual level. It levels the playing field. But think about the macro implications of that advice.
That's interesting.
If everyone from the retail investor sitting at home with a 5,000 euro ETF portfolio to the elite hedge fund manager moving billions through Dubai starts relying on the exact same large language models, the exact same AI algorithms to evaluate market risks and discover opportunities, what happens?
Does that homogeneity create a massive invisible blind spot in the global economy?
Exactly. If the AI models all share the same training data bias, or if they all mathematically fail to account for a novel, unpredictable black swan event, could our collective reliance on AI be the catalyst for the next 2008-style crash? We barely survived the algorithmic compliance of the banks. Can we survive the algorithmic convergence of the entire global market?
It brings us right back to that murky landscape. We keep trying to build the perfect technological machine to give us a clear, binary picture of our financial health. But the deeper we go and the more we rely on the machine, the murkier the waters become.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay critical, and we'll see you next time.